Well, here we are in the Creator Corner, where we sit back, relax, talk about writing books, talk about the publishing industry, talk about the comics industry. We're gonna focus on that writing book side of thing today. Uh,
Okay.
Tying into our adventures with Ghost Machine, I want to talk about hooking your readers.
Ooh.
Like, how do you have someone read the first pages or a teaser or something of your book and make them buy in, make them want to read the rest of it?
This is something I think I failed on numerous occasions. It's
Oh
such a tough
no.
thing. Like your brain is always kind of, I think, wired for like I need to hook them in the first issue. Is like your brain,
Mhm.
like just the first issue. So it's like, okay, we'll put this nice like cliffhanger or something at the end, and we'll have gotten them. They get all this information, but you don't really think about somebody giving up on your book before the end, which when you're like brand new and you sit there and like the first 6 pages are exposition dumping or something, it's like, oh, that doesn't really work. So I think an immediately interesting character is one of the best things
Mhm.
you can do because that'll buy you enough pages to get to the meat of the story. Um, that's where my head's immediately going to. But the other nice thing that you can do, which I am experimenting with right now for the first time, is starting something with an anthology story. Like starting with something that's
Mhm.
intended to be a 4, a 6, an 8, a 10-page story, so that it's like a whole thing. It's like, here's this character that maybe then you're hoping to do more with, but you can get people invested in it in a story that it's not like you have to hook them in X amount of time because they're just going to read this short story. And if that story is good enough on a whole, maybe you can hook them. I don't know, Kate. What have you had much experience with like really debating the way to hook people immediately in the
I mean,
book?
I think that that's something that you have to consider when you're figuring out where to start your book. Like you
Mm.
said, something that just lore dumps immediately isn't necessarily going to be something that invites readers to keep going. Uh, Something that I think succeeds with doing that would be something like Noctera, where the first 2 or 3 pages are talking about like the sun disappearing. But that's like a really an interesting enough concept, and you're given enough with the characters themselves there to
Yeah,
kind of justify that.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
so you
And I want to
can
add on,
then,
like the other thing there is that that's a very established creator and creative
oh yeah,
team, and they get more time and more opportunity. There's a difference
hmm,
between books that succeed from known talent and books that succeed from unknown talent. You know, read a
yeah,
lot of creators like break-in book versus the stuff they do now, and it's a very different
hmm,
dichotomy.
right. And I think the kind of biggest tip for figuring out where to start your book is figuring out just how close to the end you can start it. That's like, a general writing rule is start as
Yeah,
close
start
to
your
the
story
end
as
as
late as
possible.
possible. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Uh, and that's also going to be what's going to help hook people reading it, because that means that the first thing they see is going to be as close to the conflict as you can get. It's going to have that element of seeing what's coming and wanting to see that play out. So I think figuring out where to start your
Yeah.
book is all about figuring out uh, where it's going to be the most engaging to start your book.
I think that's a good way to put. I something else that I like that kind of popped into my head when you say it is I feel like an interesting way to do it and a way that I think is often very successful is like the abnormal normal, which is like
Mhm.
you start in a normal situation, but there's something immediately slightly off that the is going to kind of hook the reader into being like, well, I have to at least get to the point where I figure out why this is happening. You know,
Mhm.
if it's like everybody around the main character seems to have forgotten something. The main character's like, why does nobody know this thing that happened? Or if everything's just if something has changed and or some, but it's not really immediately clear what that is. I think that's a really cool
Mhm.
hook that you see in a
And it
decent amount of like normalcy breaking books.
For sure. And it's not even that it has to be something that the character knows about. I mean, if you think about
Yeah,
just a character walking down the street, not interesting. If we see the character walk past us down the street and then, like, a shadowy figure in a trench coat and fedora steps out from an alley and follows them, that kind of disruption of the expected is the type of thing that makes you want to keep reading.
yeah, yeah. I feel like I have to bring up the more old school Kirby, Eastman and Laird technique. that I don't think is done a ton anymore, but was effective, and it's that I want to throw out to you for your opinions on it, is like that starting on a splash or double splash of like character in trouble. Let's turn back the clock a little bit and figure out how they got there. I don't know if I can think of any modern book that has done that I've read, but that was a common old school technique, and I'm interested to hear. It's a common movie technique even to this day. So I'm interested to hear
we've all seen
your
the
thoughts
Bee
on
movie.
that.
I bet you're wondering how I got here. I am not personally a huge fan of that, because I think that there's certainly a place in fiction for dramatic irony, so like where the audience knows what's going to happen even though the characters don't. But I think something like, I don't know, Thor lifting up a spaceship and being crushed by it as he's lifting is not the type of effective dramatic irony. I feel like if you're going to start with something like that, you want it to be something that you can then kind of breadcrumb towards. So instead of it being, I think a good example of this might be, to a warped extent, Radiant Red, where the first thing we see of her is her bringing back that bag that she stole from the bank, and then we kind of get to see the little seeds of how that ended up happening to her. So if it's
good call out.
Yeah. If it's something that you can build up to in an effective and like important way, I think that's a valid entry. But if it's just, here's this cool action scene, don't you want to see that action scene later in the book?
Yeah.
I don't think that that's a particularly sophisticated way to go about writing. No.
Absolutely. As I actually hit in my head, like, I remember the modern way that it's done in comics, and it's typically showing you a superhero dying, and then like, how do we get here? And I'm gonna give a shout to a series that we haven't loved, but I think it's the best way it's been done in modern comics, and we really like this, is the way that the Modern Titans run did it with Wally. Because like, yes, we saw the character die and we had to build there, but so did the characters, because it was Wally going back in time to die. So it wasn't necessarily starting at the end in a normal way. It was in a way that really worked and made sense. Where they went after that, but it was a fantastically effective hook.
Oh yeah.
You read those first 2 pages of Titans 1. It's Titans 1, right? It's not 2. Titans 1.
I believe it's Titans 1, yeah. Where Wally comes running in
and
with a bullet wound.
Yeah, you are immediately hooked, and you're like, I need to read until I find out how this happened.
Yes.
So, yeah, there's ways to do it, is what I'll say. But I agree with you that it's not the most effective technique to just be like, okay, where's my cool moment? Okay, let's shove it at the beginning and then go back there. I agree with you fully on that.
Yeah, I think looking to Ghost Machine, the reason that the Exodus book was our favorite is, like you mentioned, the immediately understandable and readable characters and dynamics that make me care about the character. Like, the world is very cool, but I love the dynamics between the two characters that we saw. And that's really what drove my interest in actually picking the book up.
And based on that, let me ask you a question, because I feel like this is becoming more common in comics, and Rook Exodus does it. And I'm interested in your feelings on it, because it is something that allows you to do that, like, start at the latest moment possible. You can move that so far back with this thing, which is putting a blurb at the beginning that gives, like, that exposition information that the people need. So you can start the story at, like, that moment and not need any exposition. Rook Exodus does it. I know a couple other comics to do it that I'm reading right now.
I think Marvel does it a lot, which is super nice. The only real recent Marvel books I've read, like, I don't think it happened in Ultimate Spider-Man, but that didn't really need it because it was completely devoid of context. But Gang War has done it.
Daredevil Gang War, yeah.
Yeah. And when I read the Exterminators book, the X-Men book about killing vampires, that did it at the start of each issue. I think that's a really, really, really good idea for a big 2 book. For a book that has a, like, reason that someone would want to read it outside of the story. If it's like, oh, I like the X-Men, I'll pick up this X-Men book. And it gives you that bit of context so you can figure out where you are in this universe. That, I think, is super effective. But for your own, like, creator-owned, self-published, Kickstarter, whatever book, no, absolutely not. You cannot fall on that crutch, in my opinion.
I agree with you mostly. I agree with you on an issue 1. I don't want information that hasn't been given to me before. I really like, I can't remember what book, I think In Hell We Fight did it, or at least they did
Oh, I
like
think
kind
so
of a
too.
variation of it, of where with the like future issues they explain what happened in the issue right before, and I think
Yes.
that's really really effective
Hmm.
for one, if people are picking up a later issue without reading the earlier issues, or two, it's a month at the earliest. People
Yeah.
forget things. So I really like the books that do a little just what you need from the previous issue.
Yeah.
Of like, now our heroes have found this and they need to, bring it to this person.
Right.
Whatever
And
it is.
that's
Just that
front
little bit.
matter. If someone doesn't want to read it, they don't have to.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I think that's an interesting technique to think about when you're making a book. But I think we're both in agreement that just putting a paragraph at the beginning, even though Rook Exodus does it and we enjoyed that, it's not always the most effective way to deliver your world building.
And Rook Exodus also has the benefit of this, one, being a preview of it, and two, being a new number one from a highly publicized new publisher written by Jeff Johns.
And illustrated by Jason
And
Paypal.
yeah, exactly. So it's that thing like with the big two, where there's a reason people are going to come and read it besides just the story and the cover. I think that's going to take us to the end of our creator corner. Start as close to the end as possible. Really hit those dynamics and the interesting things about your book right away. Make it approachable, but then spin on that. And for the love of God, don't exposition dump.
Yeah, that's going to bring us to a full-on close this week. Join us next week. We'll see you then, Comic Geeks.